There are mysteries waiting to be revealed that nourish and quench the soul. We're so glad you found us. Come on in.
And so have you experimented now with channel fiction yourself?
Definitely, definitely. I would say the last part of the book, my chapter, that talks about my own experience was an act of channeling, for sure. Maybe a desperate act, I don't know. But I've used the technique. I have a technique in here that I call automatic or trance writing, and I know that those two terms are definitely mutually exclusive. Automatic writing is not directed, and most of the time when we talk about automatic writing, we're talking about planchette or parlor games. Trance writing can be somewhat more directed. However, I find that in common practice, people utilize these terms together, so that's why I called both, so that people would get the vibe of what I was trying to say. I put an exercise in here to kind of get people into that space. The reason why I did that is that I found that all of the authors that I highlight in this book have a method for getting in touch with the divine. And I took the things that I researched, the pieces of their methods, and I stitched them together into something that was coherent and easy for people to reproduce. And the method that I put in this book can be done anywhere, at any time. It's very easy, and you don't need a whole lot of props, because a lot of these women did not use a lot of props, though sometimes they did. I mean, it just depends on the flavor of the person. I myself have used automatic writing or trance writing extensively in my own practice for our group, for our rituals. I like to write poetry, and I feel like it is very much an act of channeling the divine sometimes.
Absolutely. Could you talk about the concept of the fourfold goddess?
Fourfold goddess, okay. Well, one of the things that I realized, and this was kind of more in my personal path working, along with some of the stuff that I researched as an academic, was that there's this concept of the threefold goddess. And this is kind of the normative, if there is a norm, for most of us in the Western world of goddess theology. And this is nothing wrong with the threefold goddess. It's a construct that I very much felt that I revered for quite a long time. But I felt that there was a difference between what people talked about, their theory, and what they were actually practicing. And what I found with people practicing is that the threefold goddess is more of a transcendental ideal, which is kind of out there. And it's more of an ideal in the sense of what we would like to be, or what we think the normal path of female biology is. But what we're really doing, oftentimes in our personal practice, is we have a much more personal relationship with one facet of deity. Now, it may be one of the three, or it might be something completely different. My concept of the fourfold goddess describes this organic process of how the priestess is the fourth face of the goddess. She is the reflection. She is the ideal female. And this isn't just limited to men, or to women. Men can access this too. Usually it's more through an anima kind of idea of their perfected ideal. But the fourth face of the goddess is what you bring to the table, not just your biological potential. So she doesn't have to be a mother. She doesn't have to be a maiden. She doesn't have to be a crone or any of that. You know, she could just as easily be the soror, the sister, the healer, the teacher. It's your personal passion. It's what makes you tick. So if you are a healer, that's the fourth face, independent of where you are at in your biological reproductive cycle. Because I find that recently, and this is much more in just talking with other folks, different pagan gatherings and online and people that I meet, you know, that idea of biological determinism, it's a fine place to start, but I feel that we've moved beyond that. So the fourth face is kind of our way to be able to move more towards that future.
And I really like the concept of having it not intrinsically tied to biological gender, simply because gender binary is not really, it's a problematic subject, and it causes, you know, it excludes transgender people or gender fluid people, so.
Well, definitely. I mean, there's parts that are exclusionary because it's this or that, but gender binary kind of concepts, biological dimorphism, it doesn't only limit people that are fluid. It also limits people that identify as male or female. Because the problem is that you have this idea that it's this or that, black or white, up or down. This is a fundamental concept for Western esotericism. And this is something that we need to acknowledge. You know, and that doesn't mean we necessarily have to embrace it, but I feel like we're more empowered if we acknowledge it and then we move through it. And I do think that binary genderism can definitely, you know, it can be very healing on some levels for certain people, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But our concept of goddess is much more dynamic than I think we allow for. You know, in my book, I talk a lot about the Victorian era, because I do feel like many of our concepts are very much still tied in with the Victorian era and Victorian science. These kind of concepts still have a lot to do with what's going on today. And back then, we had a lot of interesting ideas about evolutionary psychology and these really interesting mythological concepts of what must have been going on in prehistory and where we got to where we are today. Much of it was based on social construction that was going on at the time, which was very imbalanced. The problem is that we've kind of codified that, and we've taken that into the future, which is now. So one of the things that I find when I talk to others is that we've kind of become stuck in this idea of the blues versus the pinks. Even though we say we're beyond that, are we really beyond that? And in my experience, and that's just me as a person, it's limited. It's limited. And we can do better. And if we could have done this at the beginning of the 20th century, which is what they were doing back then, when these ideas first became popular through the works of Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society, I mean, she was the one that really introduced this in a big way to the West. Their concepts of goddess were very dynamic. I mean, you had women strapping on the sword, you had a lot more gender fluidity than people really think about when they think about that time. If they could do it 100 years ago, I'm pretty confident we can get there now. But sometimes people need to be reminded of where we were and where we are now.
There are mysteries waiting to be revealed that nourish and quench the soul. We're so glad you found us. Come on in.